Okay. So I want to work in my Moscow minute right now.
Okay.
Uh,
Do it.
so in terms of, uh, you know, question is why is Russia's always being brought up as a threat? Russia, I mean, it's a huge country. It's the largest country in the world. And it had a lot of natural resources, but economically, it's about on par with maybe South Korea. It's really not that, it doesn't have a strong export, except for natural gas and oil. It doesn't really have a strong manufacturing base, whatever. But we hear, recently we heard from Susan Rice that Russia maybe is behind these protests, the BLM protests, right? And we heard during Tulsi's campaign that Tulsi is a Russian asset. Why is Russia such a threat to the, to these from the perspective of these politicians, or from, to the national security state? Why is Russia being singled out as being such a threat when obviously they aren't all that powerful?
So is it precisely because economically and militaristically they're such a so minor compared to us? Is it basically that we can use them as the boogeyman without necessarily suffering, real consequences? That's one possibility, right?
That's one possibility. I mean,
yeah. That's what I think, is that you have the example of the DNC using Russia and this hoax of the hacking that happened. They used that in order to be able to not have to make any changes and just obfuscate, just be able to say, oh, look over there, and look, and they're the ones who did all these things, to put our election integrity at risk, when in actuality you have gerrymandering, you have all of these different factors that are domestic issues that have nothing to do with Russia. That's actually what affected these elections. But if we don't have a big bag boogeyman to look at, well, then we actually have to look at our own faults, and we can't deal with that.
so I would venture to say that Russia actually is a threat to these people, but not not for the reasons that they're offering. I think the ultimate goal of the neoliberal, neoconservative agenda is this kind of Pax Americana, where you're going to have neoliberal capitalism around the world under basically American domination. You're going to have Walmart in every major city. I mean, you already have Walmart as far as I know, you have it in Russia and everything already, in China, definitely. But, the question is, Putin in Russia and Xi in China, they are part of that non-aligned kind of counterweight to U.S. supremacy. And you're sure you've heard the phrase, the BRICS nations, the BRICS nations. It's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Oh,
The idea,
I did not know that.
well, if you look it up, and there's I mean, and going back in history to like the 60s, you had the non-aligned nations under Suharto in Indonesia, and you had these kind of emerging third world countries that were huge countries population-wise in terms of resources, that had been exploited by this system of neocolonialism that were rising up against that. I mean, India included. And now these countries kind of see the U.S. as a threat. They see the U.S. as like, we don't want a Pax Americana. And part of it's for economic reasons, but part of it's also for like cultural reasons. They look at the U.S. and they see like, gee, I mean, this is not what we want for our country.
Right.
Nor is that tradition of American, way of life, something that we want for our people. It doesn't conform, doesn't mix with our tradition. So I think the real ultimate goal is we want to roll over Russia, and we don't like powerful populist leaders like Putin who are going to get in the way of that. No matter what you think of Putin as a leader.
What changed since it was the Obama administration policy of Russian reset and trying to, is it like pipeline economics happening in Eastern Europe? Is that what happened, or is it that combined with the need for for a boogeyman?
I think,
And they tried running Tulsi as a Grenadian asset up the flagpole, and it didn't fly, so they had to go with Russian, right?
right, right. No, I don't know. I mean, I think they were always seeing Russia as ultimately a power to be dealt with. Whether it's, I mean, they basically see modern Russia as the heir of the Soviet period. You know, that Putin is basically, he's KGB. He grew up in the Soviet period, so he basically sees modern Russia as Soviet Union light, and that the U.S. has to defeat that power. So whether the Russian reset at the beginning of the Obama administration, I mean, I can only guess what the ultimate motive was. But I would guess I don't think it was making peace with Russia and basically patrolling the Middle East together with Russian troops. I mean, I think it was basically getting access to air bases in the Russian sphere of influence so that we could do what we need to do in Afghanistan or whatever. And I think it was less about actually trying to achieve some long-term peace with Russia. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the fact that Russia and China, they are not willing to just let the US run rampant and do whatever it wants and be the bully that it's been for, how long now,
Right. Yeah.
And the US doesn't like that. Again, it comes back to American exceptionalism. It's imperialism, it's the fact that you have Russia and China who not only have they tried to do their own pipelines, but it's also they're trying to get off the dollar. Why? Because of these sanctions, because
Right.
they're seeing how this is self-inflicted. This is a self-inflicted issue that the United States has brought upon itself because it's just been too greedy, and it's because it wants to continue to be a hegemony, and that is to our own detriment. That's going to be our own fall.
Right.
Essentially, abusing other countries is now like part of our economic policy, essentially, right? And it's like, so
well,
yeah.
Remember how Venezuela and Iran. Remember what they had to do? That they had to you had to have the Venezuelan ships kind of bring going along with the Iranian ships in order to secure and make sure that if the U.S. wanted to intercept any of the ships, that they would be able to help them out. That is when you're at that point where you have countries that are having to ally in order to kind of get around this other country, when they should be free to import oil and whatever sort of needs that they have. They should be able to import them without, having to look over their shoulders and think, oh, what's the U.S. going to think of this?
Yeah, but you look at those countries. I mean, look at Iran. We orchestrated a coup there in 1953 that was under Allen Dulles. So basically, a democratically elected president who'd actually, visited Washington and the White House as a guest of Truman was overthrown and replaced with a Shah in 1953. And the 1979 revolution was a reaction to that overthrow in some respects. So like there's a long history of U.S. Exploitation of other countries for economic benefit. It hasn't just been recently. It's been going back to basically to Teddy Roosevelt and that period of the Spanish-American War and United Fruit and banana republics. They actually are banana republics in Central America, and that tradition of exploiting countries. And also John Perkins, who wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman, a book about how he was an economic hitman. He was basically sent in, as maybe a corporate representative, but basically had CIA support. And the idea was to buy off the elites in these countries so that they could get access to the raw materials and cheap manufactured goods, or get the raw materials at very low prices, so that the majority of the population would remain in poverty, but you'd have these rich elites. And that was a system that was set up, and he wrote this book about it. He said that was the only thing that kept them from going after me, was for me to go public with this book. But he's actually written several books, John Perkins. But that whole tradition of the U.S. of going in and that was the model. That's the model of neoliberalism, and it's all backed by the World Bank. And the U.S. gets to appoint the leader of the World Bank. So basically, it's a U.S. institution that does majority of the funding for that institution. So it's, there's a long history of that. And I think Russia, definitely sees the U.S. as a threat. China sees the U.S. as a threat because the U.S., based on their tradition, they would not think twice really about, if they had the opportunity of overthrowing them and installing some kind of U.S. friendly government, right? I mean, if they can do it in Bolivia and they can do it and try to do it in Venezuela, then it's just a matter of degree to when they can try to do it in Russia and China. I mean, go ahead.
Clinton essentially bragged about getting, who is it that he essentially assisted in getting elected in Russia?
Oh, Yeltsin?
Oh, Yeltsin. Yeah.
Yeltsin, yeah. He essentially bragged about having fixed the elections essentially and worked behind the scenes to get Yeltsin elected. I mean, the reason Putin might be worried is because we've tried to do it before,
I remember with Ukraine, there was that the Russians actually intercepted that cell phone call between, what's her name? She's the wife of Robert Kagan. I can't remember her name. But she was involved with the State Department, and she was saying, basically talking about who they would select as a presidential candidate for Ukraine. And they liked this guy. His nickname was Yats, Y-A-T-S. I can't remember his full Ukrainian name, but it revealed very clearly that the U.S. was working behind the scenes to get the people they wanted in charge of that country. So that's I think there's a long history of that, and that's why they're Russia and China are justifiably concerned about the threat from outside.
Yeah.
I could go on and on, but I'll stop.